Welcome to the 13th virtual meeting of the Rotary Club of Park Cities. I'm Richard Stanford, this year's president, together with Happy Franklin, vice president of the club. This is actually the 14th time we've met outside of our normal haunts in Maggiano's, but one of those was outdoors. As those of you who attended remember, we met in a tailgate at the Biblical Arts Center, and that was fun. Too hot to do that now. But we're going to be meeting beginning the 10th of next month at Maggiano's again in person. We'll talk more about that later, but looking forward to that. Now remember, we're not going to meet next week. Next week is 4th of July. We can't have the parade, but all kinds of fun things in the place of the parade. Going to talk about that also in a moment. But before we do the program, let's begin with an invocation, and we'll follow that with our national anthem. If you would bow your heads. Father, today we pray for our healthcare providers, for their safety, and for the work they're going to be called on to do in the next few weeks. It's going to be heavier than what it was before. We hope for their financial well-being. As we started yesterday, hospitals and doctors can no longer do elective surgeries until further notice. And so instead of elective surgeries, the source of so much income we know to the doctors and the hospitals, they will be dealing with our COVID outbreaks. And so we pray for their safety. We pray for their economic well-being. We also pray that this society is inventive enough to come up with the spaces, the equipment, the staffing that's going to be necessary, particularly in the big Texas cities as we go into the next few weeks. But you know, we know you're with us, and there is an end to this at some time. And so we pray for your presence in all our difficulties. We also pray that you help us learn from what we've been through to live in new ways coming out of this that will be richer than we were before. And so with your presence, we can deal with all these things, and we thank you in your name. Amen.
Our advertising spotlight today is Charles Polanski. He's a private client advisor with Hub International Personal Insurance. What you may not know about Charles is that he was a sports writer for the Star-Telegram for over a decade. He's been in Dallas since 1998 and with Hub International since 2008. With over 300 offices and 6,000 employees, Hub International is one of the largest and most sophisticated personal insurance practices in the country. The Private Client Advisor Group offers advice to high net worth individuals, family offices, and wealth advisors to help protect everything from your homes, cars, boats, second homes, recreation vehicles, investment properties, and your treasured belongings. Charles uses a holistic approach, so when you need a second opinion, he's your man. Let's thank Charles and all of our PCR Marketplace sponsors today. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to have some fun this coming week. As I said, we're not going to be able to have our parade, and we traditionally do not have our Friday meeting before the 4th of July, so there'll be no meeting next week. But the parade group has come up with all kinds of fun alternatives. We have 13 yard entries, 6 block entries, for judging. We'll be judging on the 3rd, going to see what kind of patriotic displays they have in their yards and on their blocks. There's a kids patriotic art, and they're already getting wonderful art in. And several events have already happened, like with Lady Scots and the boys basketball. They have already raised thousands of dollars at their events that have taken place recently. We'll leave it to the committee, the parade group, to announce what all those figures are, but you will be struck with how large the amount of money these young people have raised. All of this for the North Texas Food Bank. So get ready to hear more about who's the winner. It'll be up right after that on the 4th, and you can see who won with both yards and blocks with their patriotic displays. Maggiano's, we keep supporting Maggiano's. We'll begin meeting at Maggiano's on the 10th, and we'll make sure that it's basically socially distanced. You'll get the rules, and let me show you one thing. I'll put it on for just a second. That's what everybody's going to get on July 10th when they come to the meeting.
Compliments of Richard.
Yes, and my pleasure, because I think that's a neat branding piece. So basically, we'll see you on the 10th. The good thing about this is that a lot of us in the club, we're a big club, and a lot of people believe that we should have met before this, and a lot of people believe we shouldn't be meeting now. And so in the midst of all that, we will meet, and those who have difficulties with meeting, you can watch it streamed. We're one of the few clubs that stream in this district, so you can watch it if you feel better at home, and if you feel better getting together at Maggiano's, you can do that too. So hopefully we will meet everybody's needs. Now, the North Texas Food Bank continues to be active in the community. You may have seen an article in the news just a few days ago with our member Trish Cunningham and all the work that they are doing to feed those in need in Dallas. We're proud of being part of that, proud of having provided one of the food trucks for the North Texas Food Bank, and proud that Trish is a member of our club. And so you can continue giving through our 4th of July link. You see the 4th of July parade donation link. You can join all those Lady Scots and all the boys on the basketball team and all those who have already raised money. We've raised an amazing amount from other sources and sponsors. We've also raised from our own foundation. So hopefully we will be providing welcome support to the North Texas Food Bank. It's always fun. Fred Brown did it yesterday, I think. Either Fred or Karen. Somebody did it yesterday. But every Thursday, we deliver food to our strategic partner, Agape Clinic, as they continue to work to meet the health needs of lower-income people in this city. And we keep them from having to go out and get the food and bring it back. We bring it to them so they can continue doing their valuable work. So if you want to be part of that by giving for food or by delivering, I've done it. I'll tell you, it's really fun and inspiring. Get a hold of Fred Brown. His email's on the screen. And never forget the world work that Rotary International does. We're a club that has given so much to Rotary International. Greg Pape is our cheerleader for that, and both to Rotary International for all its wonderful work around the world, and also to our own foundation. Our foundation has put aside a good amount of funds over several years to fund our Agape Bonton Clinic project, the ABC project, to basically bring medical hospitalization, medical clinic kind of treatment to the Bonton Farms area. And so that's one of our big projects that will really be coming even more online. We've raised $100,000 or so, but we're going to raise $150,000 or more for that and make a difference in medical care in the Bonton Farms area. And join me in looking for speakers. We're always looking for good programs. I never hear something that I don't tell Jeff Sheehan that would probably be a good program, and several of you are doing that. We can't meet in person as a program committee, but you can feed all your recommendations to Jeff, and we'll take a look at them because we have a good slate of programs. And speaking of that, Keith Campbell.
I need the clicker. I am really thrilled to introduce Keith Campbell. Keith Campbell is the Vice President and Managing Editor of the Dallas Morning News. He oversees the organization's news gathering efforts and day-to-day operation of the newsroom. In Keith's nearly 30-year career at the Dallas Morning News, he has held a variety of editing positions. These include interim managing editor, deputy managing editor for news and business, assistant managing editor for news, suburbs editor, and deputy sports editor. In addition, he has served as the page one editor, both for the daily and the Sunday edition. He's directed coverage of numerous major stories, including the 2016 Dallas police ambush. The news coverage was chosen as a finalist for the 2017 Pulitzer Prize. For the past 3 months, he has led the Dallas Morning News coverage of everything COVID-19 related in North Texas, as well as the protest and calls for social justice following the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Earlier in his career, he shepherded the newsroom's coverage of major sporting events, including the Texas Rangers' 2 World Series appearances, and he led a team of reporters and photographers to the 2008 Olympics in Beijing. Keith has served as the Vice President for the Dallas Morning News charity since 2014. He participates in numerous journalism organizations, including the Online News Association and News Leaders Association. He served as a juror for the 2017 Pulitzer Prizes in the feature writing category and was the jury chair for that category in 2018. Early in his career, he worked at the St. Petersburg Times, as well as newspapers in Kansas and Alabama. He tells me he's a fellow Chiefs fan, so I like him really well. He's a graduate of the University of Missouri. Keith lives in Dallas with his wife, Sarah. They have a grown daughter and son. Let's welcome Keith Campbell.
Well, thanks, everybody. It's great to be here, and thank you for the great introduction. I should tell you that I've really admired the work of the Rotary Club for years. My late father-in-law, who lived in Kansas City, was active up there in Kansas City for many years. So it's good to be with y'all today. I was telling the folks before we started the photo of me on the program, I look a lot younger than I do now. It's been about 10 years ago that photo was taken, and I think in the last 3 months, my hair has turned even grayer and my beard as well. So what I normally do in a talk like this is we talk about the great social and technological disruption and pressure that newspapers in the United States and around the country face. In this case, we're going to talk about COVID, and we're going to talk about the social unrest that's occurred in the last 3 or 4 months, or 3 or 4 weeks, and we're going to talk about how the newsroom goes about covering not one but 2 once-in-a-generation stories. And we will talk a little bit about objectivity, I hope, and whether there is truly objectivity in the news. We'll talk about the steps we are taking to keep our journalists safe, and we'll also talk about how we're keeping the public safe too when we're working with sources and going out and interviewing people. So I thought I'd first start with just a little bit about myself, just personally. I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky. My mother was a school teacher. My father was in the music business, actually born in New York City. My folks split up and when I was really young, and both my folks were from Louisville. My mom moved back to Louisville, and I graduated from high school there and went off to the University of Missouri, which is one of the best journalism schools in the country. I was really blessed to be part of that program, and it has molded me and guided me for more than 30 years. It's 36 years, actually. I graduated in 1984. So I realized I wanted to be a journalist around senior year of high school when I realized I'm not cutting it in science and I'm not cutting it in math. And I have a real interest in the world, had a real interest in the world, and was really good at writing and more verbal tasks and written tasks. So I figured I'd give it a shot, and also had a little bit of family history. My great grandfather was a columnist at the Louisville Times. I'm sure many of you remember afternoon newspapers. We had one here when I first got here, and he was a columnist for the Louisville Times, which was an afternoon paper. And it was one of the two papers there in Louisville, family owned and really strong newspaper family running those two papers. And so he was a columnist in the 20s and 30s. Obviously never met him, but I heard a lot of family stories about him and thought he had led an interesting life. He wrote about, he was a humorist, and I've read his clips from back in the day, and the humor escapes me now. Times have changed, but I'm immensely proud of him. So after graduating from Missouri, I worked in a couple of small papers in Montgomery, Alabama. That was my first stop, and in Wichita, Kansas, where I met my wife, who's a former journalist. Went to the St. Pete Times, and then came to Dallas in 1990, and I got here as fast as I can. I'm sure nobody's ever said that before, but I really have enjoyed my time in Texas, and never in our wildest dreams believed we would be here 30 years later and have raised 2 adult children and had a career that I never dreamed I'd have. So that's a little bit about how I got into journalism. My view of my job and journalism has changed over the years. When I first started, like most people, you're just trying to get your foot in the door. You're trying to build a career and gain some traction, and you're trying different things. And the mission of journalism really wasn't what drove me at the time. It was really just the fun of doing the job, and I didn't think of sort of the higher calling of and the importance of it. Over the years, that's changed, partly probably because of just natural maturity. Part of it is just from seeing how social forces and political forces and natural forces all affect how we live, and journalism is really important, more important than ever, to convey to folks accurate information so that they can be productive citizens and vote and be informed and make good decisions about their lives. So that's a little bit about my motivation. At the news, I started in 1990, and there were 2 papers. The Dallas Times-Herald was still in existence, and the Morning News and the Times-Herald were in the midst of a newspaper war. At that point, the Morning News was winning that war, and it was pretty clear the Times-Herald was going to go away, and it did about a year after I got there, in I think December of '91. I got to the news the Monday after Thanksgiving of 1990, so this will be 30 years, this November 26th. And right at that time, the big story was, holy moly, we're going to go to war with Iraq, who had invaded Kuwait. And that was a huge story, and to see the resources that the Morning News applied to that at the time was really something I was proud of, and something I'll remember for a long time. So I kind of worked my way through the newsroom and doing a lot of different jobs, and ultimately, not ultimately, but fairly far along in the path at the news, I was the page 1 editor. So I was in charge of the front page and making decisions about what would be on the front page. And folks would go home at night and leave the paper sort of in my hands, and that is kind of a scary thing when you're young, but it's also a lot of fun. And I really liked to try to, my challenge to myself every night was, let's try to make the paper better than it was when all the top editors left. And some days I was successful and some days I wasn't. But it was really an exciting, fun job, and it touched every part of the newsroom, which I really enjoyed doing. And then about 13 years ago, I decided I wanted to go work in sports because I thought it would be fun. I was a huge sports fan, for starters, and I thought it would be fun to work with reporters who are working on major events. And the job that I stepped into afforded me the great opportunity to go to Beijing in 2008 for the Summer Olympics. And that was just a phenomenal experience. As a 10-year-old, I watched the 72 Olympics and thought, I want to get to the Olympics sometime in my life. And to go and to be paid to do that is just amazing. And it was really great to be over there for about a month. I missed my family immensely, and worked crazy hours, probably 15 to 16 hours a day, every day. And dealing with a 13-hour time difference, it was a massively challenging work environment, but really, really rewarding. So then I moved into a couple of editing roles and ultimately became in charge of, for a little while, I was the interim managing editor running the newsroom while the new editor was coming on board. And then he chose somebody else to be the managing editor at the time, but I was basically the third in command as the deputy managing editor. And then I stepped into the managing editor role in 2018 in March. So what does a managing editor do? And what does an editor do? They're very similar things, but there's some key differences. So Mike Wilson is the editor of the paper, and he sets the strategy for the paper, for the newsroom, news coverage, and what we cover. He has a more forward-facing job in the sense that he interacts a lot more with the community than I do. I face sort of inward. I am facing the rest of the newsroom and directing them, the different departments, based on the strategy we've set. Another way to look at it is Mike is the navigator in a car, and I'm driving, and he tells me where to go. Occasionally, he lets me be the navigator, and he drives. But basically, my job is to manage and to edit, and I prefer the editing part. It's more fun, but the managing part is really fulfilling and challenging as well. And the two different aspects of the job really combine to create a very fast-paced, very all-consuming job a lot of days, and one that is full of unpredictability. And I can talk a little bit about just today. There's some unpredictability in the job. I get up every morning about 5:30, read the newspaper. I've already read a lot of it before it's been published. But I read a lot of other papers. I read websites, check Twitter, and other social media. And then I get on my exercise bike and ride for a while. And today when I was on the exercise bike, I got wind that we were going to be reporting the news that Greg Abbott has shut down the bars and reduced the occupancy at restaurants, and also shut down some outdoor recreational activities, all because of the massive rise in cases in Texas. And so we were the first to report that news. And so I was heavily involved in just the understanding that was coming and talking about how we would get that news out to our audience as quickly as possible, and what would be coming next, and trying to understand how we got the story first, which is a great thing. So that that started at 7 o'clock in the morning, and so my day often starts at that hour. And can go deep into the evening. Not like nonstop, unabated. There'll be periods where I can break away and stay away from a phone, stay away from the news, which is really challenging in my job and really important to do too, for a lot of reasons, to take breaks. The news business has changed immensely over the last 30 years. It's changed immensely over the last 3 months, 4 months. So I can talk a little bit about how we got to where we are today, and tell you a little bit about the work we're doing remotely and how we go about doing it. Do you have anything you want to ask?
Yes, I have lots of questions for you. So how much longer will y'all be working remotely?
We will be working remotely for the foreseeable future. It's not clear. At one point, we thought we would be back in the office, maybe by now, if not sooner, when we started planning the return pretty quickly, because there's so much to consider. But with the cases on the rise, I don't see that happening. And in a lot of newspapers around the country, they're not going back till 2021. Some cases, in New York City, for instance. And I would expect that we're going to see that play out in other cities as well. I hope we get back before then, because I miss working with people face to face. It's really hard. If I have to attend another Zoom meeting, I'm going to go crazy.
Does it impact the news reporting though?
No, not really. And that's a great question and a good segue into sort of how we got to where we are now working. In March, early March, we sent a number of journalists to a national journalism conference, about 9 or 10 journalists from our newsroom, to attend a conference for investigative reporting. It was in New Orleans, and they came back on Monday into the office after being gone for 3 or 4 days. And I think that afternoon or evening, we learned that someone, not someone from our newsroom, but one of the 1,000 journalists who was attending had COVID, had tested positive for COVID. And we learned that one of our journalists had interacted with that person closely for some time on one day during that conference. All of those journalists were sent home and had to quarantine for 14 days. Thankfully, none of them came down with COVID. That was our warning sign suddenly that this is really about to hit us. We first reported in the Dallas Morning News about COVID on Sunday, January 5th. And it was a very small story inside the paper, very sparse in details, saying simply that the World Health Organization was reporting of a mysterious virus in Wuhan, China. And we didn't report anything more about the coronavirus for another week, because there really wasn't any news coming out of the Associated Press or the New York Times. It was very unclear what was going on. But very quickly, it became clear it was going to be a international story, and a fear that it would come over here. And then by March, it was rapidly arriving in North Texas. Probably was already there and we weren't aware of it. So after we sent those folks home, we started to make preparations for working from home. Not clear when we were going to do it. That was around, it's the first week of March, as I recall. So the week of March 8th, we We left the building. We left the building on Friday, March 13th. And we initially did it as an experiment to see if we could all work remotely. And some portion of our newsroom had already left. The folks who actually write the headlines and do the work that I was describing that I used to do as page one editor, those folks were working in their homes. And there was a lot of question about, oh my gosh, how are we going to do this? The Morning News has never missed a day of publication in its history. We're not going to let that happen, but this is going to be challenging. Well, it turned out it really wasn't as challenging as we thought from a logistical aspect. So we left on March 13th, and we haven't been back. And that's, I think, 105 days, if I count right. During that time, we've been on tons and tons of Zoom calls and phone calls, and we work. The work is a little harder in the sense of having to do everything remotely. It takes more time. We're a very collaborative operation where you're working with photographers and reporters and graphic artists and audience specialists and editors, and you want to be in the same room, but you can't. We've done a little work in the newsroom individually. I go in there occasionally. I was there this morning for 15 minutes. I've been in there for 3 hours is the longest time I've been there, and I think I've only been there 5 times since I left. The work is, that fact, all of that is invisible to the reader, which I think is testament to the work of the great team we have at the news. Readers would not know that we were all working from our homes. And in some cases, some folks are working from out of town. And it's a real challenge. And the big uncertainty to me is how long we will be doing it that way. And I feel profoundly grateful for the team that I have and the work they do. That week that we left, you'll recall that was the week that the county, suddenly there were county declarations, the NBA shut down, the president shut down the travel from Europe, the stock market went to the pits. It was just a mess, and we were working, everybody was working around the clock, it felt like. Things slowed down for a little while. And they certainly slowed down when the cases started to stabilize. And then we've been watching and monitoring what was going to happen as each step of the reopening has occurred. And then we started dealing with a second massive story right after Memorial Day. It was on Memorial Day that George Floyd was killed. And the first protests in Dallas were that Friday night, the following Friday night, and things quickly turned ugly Friday and Saturday, particularly Saturday, as I recall. There was looting and property damage, and police were shooting tear gas at protesters on Friday. One of our reporters was hit directly by tear gas. It landed very close to him, and he was incapacitated, and it was really scary for him. Another staff member was hit by a rubber bullet and suffered a pretty severe bruise. And we send folks out into the street with PPE and goggles and helmets and anything we can give them to protect them from the possibility they're going to be harmed, but we have to be out there. And it's a scary thing it was a really scary thing on that Friday night to have. I think we had half a dozen or so journalists, maybe more, out different parts of the city and reports of tear gas and what was going on. It was quite frightening for them, and also scary for me thinking about their well-being. I'm really proud of the work they did and the work they continue to do. The protests have calmed down or slowed down, but the thing that we're focusing now on is what is the discussion and what are the things that are occurring as community leaders and activists and the police department and city political establishment discuss change and what changes will occur. I think that's a story that's going to play out for a while COVID is happening, and those two things will occupy a ton of our time. One thing that I wish we had was more people in our newsroom. We have a newsroom of about 150 people, and that includes folks in Austin and Washington, D.C. That's a smaller newsroom than we had 2 years ago. It's a much smaller newsroom than the one I entered in November of 1990, and that's due to the enormous technological and financial changes that have occurred as the internet was developed and it's basically it's our lives now. The internet is our lives, and so we deal with shifting reader habits, and advertising dollars are not coming to newspapers the way they once did. So we have a smaller staff, and we have to make choices about what we cover. In the case of COVID, that's almost all we're covering, because COVID it affects everything about our lives, whether it's the financial implications, the public health implications, the political implications. And we have moved some folks around the newsroom to work in jobs that they normally don't do. We believe we're a flexible newsroom, and that flexibility is really important. So, for instance, Evan Grant, who covers the Rangers, is one of the best baseball writers in the country, has covered some restaurant news over the last 2 months, and that's actually in his wheelhouse because he loves food, and he is a foodie, and so he has been doing that. Though his attention is about to get back to baseball. It already has returned with spring training starting next week. So we use him to supplement our food coverage. We used a couple other sports writers to supplement our protest coverage and our COVID coverage. We moved somebody who covers federal courts to our business team, because the business news that needed to be covered was just exploding all around us. And so I'm always looking for another way to use to deploy a person or use a person in the service of what we do. Anything else you want to ask?
Oh, yes, I have lots of questions.
Yeah.
I'm glad your reporters were safe. It sounds like they're very committed to getting the news reported accurately.
Absolutely, yeah. And they, they go out there and don't know what it's going to be like. And the Sunday after the protests began, the city enacted a curfew that started at 7 o'clock, I think. And I think it was announced around 5 o'clock. And we had reporters out, and, the police don't know that the reporters are reporters. They see them and they think, are they protesters? So, some tense moments. Everything worked out at the end. But, there's tense moments where it looks like your reporters are going to get arrested or, put into custody. That's kind of a frightening thing. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The photographers I think the photographers have it even more of a dangerous situation, because when they're out on the street shooting, you're looking in that camera view, and you can't see anything around you peripherally. You're focused on that zone. If you're a reporter and you have that ability to be aware of your surroundings, which is key for both, the avoiding any kind of violence, and also avoiding folks who are getting too close to you in the time of COVID.
Another place that's seen violence is Hong Kong. What are your thoughts on China imposing national security law there and the effect that it's going to have on the press there?
I'm very concerned about that. I believe in a free press, and I have a little experience from having a smidge of experience from having gone to Beijing in 2008. What I recall when we got over there, as we were going over there, we learned we weren't going to be able to use Facebook, which had just started. Most people weren't using it yet, but some of us were. It was shut down. Several other sites, I think even maybe Google was shut down. I can't recall, but just that knowledge going in was like, oh, we're going into a different type of society. And China at the time in 2008 was really trying to show the world through the Olympics that it was this powerful economy and a society that was a world power and was trying to build goodwill. You don't do that by shutting down the press. We were able to work at the Olympics with good freedom, very good freedom in covering sporting events. The Chinese were very good about security in the sense of covering the Olympics could be dangerous. You're a terrorism target. You never know what might happen. But they had a strong security force. But you could tell that they were monitoring us very closely, and there was an enormous amount of credentialing process that you had to go through before the games. I recall two things. I'll tell a quick story that involves both things that kind of show you the extent to which you're being monitored. I used a BlackBerry at the time. Everybody remember BlackBerries? I don't think the iPhone had just come out. And I probably from sleep deprivation, left my BlackBerry on a bus. And I was like, holy smokes, what am I going to do? I don't speak the language. I have no way of communicating with my reporters out in the field. Well, I went to bed that night fretting, and the next morning I went to breakfast, and I came back to my room, and the BlackBerry was in my room.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And I thought, well, there's probably a chip in that BlackBerry now, and I'll be monitored for the rest of my life, or the rest of the time I use that BlackBerry. So that was a weird situation. And then the night of the opening games, we were going over to the stadium, and I had a backpack slung over my shoulder, and you have to go through this enormous security detail before you get on a bus to go about 3 or 4 miles over to the Olympic Stadium. Well, it's exciting. You're really keyed up, and I left my backpack. I took my backpack off, and I also had a bottle of water with me, and I'd gone through security, and they wanted me to drink the water to show that it wasn't an explosive device or something. So I took a sip, and I put my backpack down. Well, I didn't pick it up and got on the bus. And I was like, holy smokes, when I got to the stadium, and I raced back on another bus, and the backpack was sitting on the ground by all the security, and they didn't even notice it. It was like, okay, from one extreme to the other. You can find my BlackBerry and get it to me. You can't notice there's a backpack sitting right next to you, an unintended backpack. But getting back to your question, the lack of press freedom is a very concerning thing all over the world. It's extremely concerning. In China, there are several American newspapers that have lost, who have had journalists expelled from there. We don't have a bureau there, and we don't go there anymore. We haven't been there since 2008, but we're concerned as fellow journalists about what's happening. The citizens there aren't being told the truth. I have a friend there who I met at the Olympics, a young man who was probably 20, who was essentially what we call a fixer. He helped me and my team with logistical issues, navigational issues. When you left the protection of the sporting areas and went out into the city or the country, it was great to have an interpreter, and great to have somebody who knew the lay of the land. He came to the United States a year later, visited me. I took him to Chewy's. His mind was blown. He would tell me stories about what was going on in China and the lack of freedom there, and like he can't get on Facebook. And occasionally he pops up on. I see him pop up on Instagram, and I know he's okay. I was very worried about him during the coronavirus, and he and I exchanged some emails. But he'll go a long period where I won't hear from him, and I wonder what's going on. And he desperately wanted to move here to the United States, but has not been able to do that.
Well, thanks for sharing that. So, what's one of your favorite stories?
Ever?
Yeah.
My
you've done.
career
Yeah.
that I've done or been involved in?
Right.
I'll go to Evan Grant again, baseball. Father's Day was just last Sunday, and I think in like 2011 he wrote a story about his father, who was attending his last baseball game and was attending it with Evan. Evan took a few days off from being with the Rangers and went to, I guess maybe it was still called Fulton County Stadium. I'm not sure. It was in Atlanta, where Evan grew up, and he took his father, who was very ill, took him to the ballpark and just wrote this wonderful personal story about the last time he was ever going to go to a baseball game with his dad. And I read that story every year. I lost my dad in 1996, and that story just resonates with me. That's a favorite that comes to mind.
I love it. That's awesome. And it sounds like we have some questions from the audience.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions from the studio audience. One from Toby Zeidel is, hang on, let me see here. I'm trying to get back to it here. Oh, can you address the balance in news coverage between the Dallas Morning News and Dallas's local television stations?
Well, I'm not sure what we mean by balance, but I can talk a little bit about the difference between our newsrooms and our approach to news. TV newsrooms are a lot smaller than newspapers in terms of personnel. It's amazing. We have a media partner, KXAS, NBC5, and some of our reporters, you'll see them on TV at times, and occasionally we collaborate on stories. And I was shocked to learn how small an operation they have, small but mighty. TV is a visual medium, and so the stories that they'll focus on have to have strong visuals. There has to be visual, compelling nature to them. For us, we're not limited by that. So we might focus on a story about voting rights that they wouldn't do because they don't. It's not a particularly, if we're doing something sort of that's about upcoming elections, there may not be a visual opportunity for them, and it won't hold their audience, the attention of their audience. It's very hard to write for TV. I've tried it a few times in my career. Just the style of writing is different. So I'm not exactly sure what we mean by balance, but there's a big difference in our approach.
I think that's where he was trying to get to.
Sure.
Also from Roger Friedline, has it become more difficult to validate information and stories before publication?
Well, I can talk about a few experiences with that. I'm not going to talk about validation first. I'll talk a little bit about access from a sport. I'm drawing on my sports background. When I came to the sports department, it was a sort of a turning point where college programs and even high school programs were limiting the access that reporters had to players and to coaches, and teams were starting to build their own websites and their own media operations to tell their story the way they wanted their story to be told. So from a sports standpoint, things have certainly changed. From a validation standpoint, we work very hard to validate stories. We don't want to print anything that's not true, and we have very strong newsroom guidelines and policies that address that and safeguard that. We at the morning news, our staff stories rarely use anonymous sources. Not never, but rarely in the news pages. We use anonymous sources in staff stories for sports coverage a lot. It's a thing it's how it has to be. It's sort of the way it works across the industry. Agents and coaches and team personnel won't talk to members of the media unless they have anonymity. But even then, we vet things. And so if we have an anonymous source in a story, we can't publish it unless a senior editor has signed off on it. And that usually means me or the editor of the paper. And so we also need to know the identity of the person. The full true identity of the person. And typically we want more than one anonymous source if we're basing a story on what that person is telling us. It's better to have two than one. There's lots of conversation, a lot of discussion about whether to use anonymous sources, and many times we reject the use of them and say, you got to go back and get the person to be willing to speak on the record.
Okay, and your friend Jeff Brady says hello, and he wants to know, are you concerned about the diminished footprint of newsrooms and full-time journalists covering local school districts, municipal governments, and public officials?
Absolutely. I'm very concerned about it. The Dallas Morning News' footprint has diminished. We used to have bureaus all over the North Texas area with, in some cases, like up in Plano, with a large staff. And now we're focused primarily in Dallas. We have a little bit of a focus on Collin County and a little bit to the west. Like we cover a little bit of Arlington. One thing we've done to try to alleviate that is we've started a collection of newsletters that I think we have at least 10, if not more now, around the community that are focused on each suburb. So Frisco has one, Plano, Garland, Arlington, a number of others, and we are using those as sort of mini websites to give folks news they need, sports, education, restaurant openings and closings and the like.
And a question from our current president, soon to be immediate past president, Richard Stanford.
One of them's kind of silly, but I've always wondered. Comics and puzzles are a whole section, and it just keeps going. And so I wanted to see, obviously that is very popular, or that wouldn't be. I wanted you just to comment on that. The other one's a little more serious. By my reading, and I read the Dallas Morning News every day.
Thank you.
Yes, but your editorials and your reporting are fairly consistent. I notice in other publications. I'll mention the Wall Street Journal, which I also take. The reporting seems to be, fact-based, and then you go to the editorial page, and it is the political opposite of whatever the New York Times said. It's like there's almost a disconnect between the editorials that paper does and the reporting that paper does, and I don't know how you maintain the consistency you maintain and why they don't, and so that's my question.
Okay, that's a great question, and I can talk about that at length, but I'll first talk a little bit about the comics, which I jokingly call the third rail. Don't mess with the comics. Don't mess with the comics, because you'll hear from readers immediately. A couple years ago, a couple summers ago, we somehow, through a production error, left out the jumble, a little puzzle. It was an immediate and swift response from readers. It was and rightfully so. It was unintended, but it happened, and we took steps to make sure it never happens again. if we change our comics, there's a lot of discussion about it, and we rarely do. There's a lot of interest in the comics. On the other issue, editorial and news coverage. So I should have mentioned earlier that the Dallas Morning News, like all newspapers, have a strict division between the editorial department and the news department. So I have no input or influence or any participation in the crafting of editorials, the choice of what topics to cover in editorials, the position of the editorial board. So the editorial board is made up of experienced journalists who are typically former reporters and editors, and their knowledge of the community and their knowledge from reporting informs their editorials. There's a man named Brendan Miniter, who is the editor of the editorial board, and he's sort of my counterpart. Occasionally I'll go to an editorial board meeting because newsmakers are brought in, and it's important for the newsroom to be there because we want to ask those newsmakers questions to learn things that are on their mind or things they're working on, and those answers are on the record, and we sometimes they break news. Hypothetical: a police chief could be at the editorial board meeting and say, we're going to announce later today that we're adding more staff, and that would be news, and we would report that. But we don't have, like, our political reporters have no knowledge of who the editorial board is going to recommend for office. There's often a lot of, I'm sure there's a little wagering. Which way is the editorial board going to go on candidate X or candidate Y? The Wall Street Journal is, has a conservative bent on its editorial board. The Dallas Morning News does too. Over the years, your positions and sort of your overall ideological bent may shift depending on who's running that team, who is in charge of that team, and the makeup of the team and their backgrounds. And then also editorials, one thing for everyone to know, editorials are written by one person, but they convey the overall approach or thought position of the institution. So an editorial board will debate, sometimes very ardently, about a particular position, very passionately about a position, but ultimately a decision will be made about what the institution's path will be, and someone on that board will write that editorial to reflect the institutional position. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Thank you. Are journalists objective?
No. There's a myth out there that journalists are objective. I think that sometimes objectivity is what really people are asking is, are they fair, or are they accurate? Are they unbiased? We all have biases, and we all have personal experiences that influence how we go about our jobs and how we view the world. And I think for a long time, journalism, there's been this myth that there's objectivity, true objectivity. There are safeguards that are built in, the values that we have at the Morning News to tell stories fairly, to consider all sides to every important question, which is actually written inscripted in granite outside our old building, and is part of a message from our former publisher. Those things we live and breathe, and they're in our DNA. But we all have personal experiences that influence how we view the world and the choices we make. So that's a good question.
Thank you. Y'all, I think y'all do a great job staying objective. Others like CNN are definitely have a really strong slant, and so I appreciate that y'all really focus on being more objective. My final question is, what main charities does the Dallas Morning Charities support?
So the Dallas Morning News Charities has 23 nonprofits it works with, and they are geographically dispersed all over North Texas. And they've been in existence. The charities has been around since the 80s, and I've been on the board for several years, and it's really personally fulfilling to do that work. You mentioned the North Texas Food Bank. It's one of them. And in fact, later this afternoon, some folks from the board will be talking to the North Texas Food Bank about next year. And we go through a cycle of talking to all the different charities that are in our slate. We usually talk to them in the summertime, and that's scheduled for later this afternoon. I'm looking forward to it.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us today. So next week, we're not having a meeting. We're having our 4th of July activities. We'd love for you to enjoy your time with your friends and family. And now, without any further ado, we're going to say the 4-way test of the things we think, say, or do. First, is it the truth? Second, is it fair to all concerned? Third, will it build goodwill and better friendships? And fourth, will it be beneficial to all concerned? Thank you for joining us. Hope you have a fabulous, fun, and safe holiday weekend. And stay safe. Thank you.